The night was supposed to be just another routine drive home for FBI agent Marcus Reed. Dressed casually, blending into the city's late-night hum, he had no idea his quiet evening was about to take a turn that would shake the entire police department. A red and blue glare filled his rearview mirror. The sharp wail of a siren followed. Marcus sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew how these things could go. As the officer approached, Marcus kept his hands on the wheel, calm and collected. "License and registration," the cop barked, his tone sharp and impatient. Marcus moved slowly, reaching for his wallet. "Is there a problem, officer?" The cop, a middle-aged man with a hardened expression, narrowed his eyes. "Don't talk, just do what you're told." Something about the way he looked at Marcus, like he had already made up his mind about him, set off alarm bells. Marcus had dealt with men like this before, but what happened next was beyond anything he expected. The officer grew aggressive, accusing Marcus of resisting, despite him following every command. And then, without warning, the punch came, a hard, sudden blow that sent Marcus staggering. For a moment, there was silence. The officer smirked, satisfied. But then Marcus straightened, wiped his lip, and reached into his jacket, pulling out his badge. The cop's face drained of color. "You just assaulted a federal agent," Marcus said, his voice steady. "And now you're under arrest." The officer took a step back, his confidence shaken. His smirk disappeared, replaced by something else: fear, confusion, maybe even regret. But Marcus wasn't about to let him off easy. The street was quiet, the hum of passing cars in the distance. The officer's partner, a younger cop who had been standing by the squad car, shifted uncomfortably. His hand hovered near his radio, unsure of what to do. "Wait a minute," the officer stammered, trying to regain control. "Let's not make this a big deal." Marcus let out a slow breath, keeping his composure. "Oh, it's already a big deal," he said. He pulled out his phone, snapping a picture of the officer's badge. "What's your name?" The cop's jaw clenched. "Why does that matter?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Because I like to know who I'm arresting." The younger cop finally spoke up. "Maybe we should call this in." His voice wavered, and he looked at his partner, unsure of where his loyalty should lie. Marcus could see the wheels turning in both their heads. They hadn't expected this. They thought they were in charge, that they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. But this time they had picked the wrong person. A tense silence filled the air. The officer swallowed hard, shifting on his feet. For the first time that night, he realized he wasn't the one holding the power anymore. The officer's breathing grew uneven, his fingers twitching at his side. He had spent years throwing his weight around, never expecting to be the one answering questions. But now, under Marcus's steady gaze, his authority crumbled. The younger cop hesitated, then finally reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we have a situation." His voice trailed off, unsure of how to explain what was happening. Marcus kept his stance firm. "You assaulted a federal agent," he repeated, his voice calm but unwavering. "That alone is enough to put you in cuffs. But let's talk about why you stopped me in the first place." The officer clenched his jaw. "You look suspicious." Marcus let the words hang in the air. He had heard it before, too many times. It was the excuse that turned everyday moments into nightmares for people who looked like him. But this time, there were consequences. "I'm going to need your badge number," Marcus said, taking a step closer. "And I suggest you cooperate." The officer's eyes darted around, looking for an escape. His partner stood frozen, his hands still on the radio, waiting for instructions that weren't coming. The distant sound of another patrol car approaching made the officer tense up. Help was on the way, but not for him. Marcus didn't move. He didn't need to. For the first time, the officer realized he had made a mistake he couldn't walk away from, and the night was far from over. The flashing lights of the approaching patrol car reflected off the nearby buildings. bathing the street in an eerie red and blue glow. The officer swallowed hard, his confidence slipping further with every passing second. His hands balled into fists at his sides, but he didn't move. He knew it was too late to backtrack now. The younger cop took a small step away from his partner, as if silently distancing himself from the situation. His face was tight with uncertainty. "Look, maybe we should just—" Marcus cut him off with a sharp look. "Maybe you should think real carefully about what happens next," he said, his voice steady. "Because your career is on the line too." The officer's breathing grew heavier. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "I didn't do anything wrong." Marcus let out a small, humorless laugh. "Didn't do anything wrong? You punched me, threatened me, and now you're trying to act like this is nothing." He shook his head. "Not this time." The patrol car finally pulled up, tires screeching slightly as it came to a stop. Two officers stepped out, their faces unreadable as they took in the scene. One of them, a sergeant, frowned as he looked between Marcus and the officer standing stiffly beside him. "What's going on here?" the sergeant asked. Marcus didn't take his eyes off the officer. "That's a good question," he said, his tone sharp. "Why didn't you ask him?" The sergeant's eyes narrowed as he turned to the now silent officer. The tension in the air was thick, pressing down on everyone. No one spoke. Because in that moment, they all knew this was about to explode. The sergeant folded his arms, his sharp gaze shifting between Marcus and the officer. The silence stretched, thick with tension. The younger cop shifted uncomfortably, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Finally, the officer who had thrown the punch let out a breath, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. I don't even know who this guy is." Marcus raised an eyebrow and reached into his jacket, pulling out his FBI credentials. "Now you do." The sergeant's expression darkened as he stepped closer, examining the badge. His jaw tightened, but he kept his tone measured. "Agent Reed, do you want to explain what happened here?" Marcus met his eyes. "I was pulled over without cause, treated like a suspect and assaulted. And when I identified myself, he tried to act like none of it happened." The officer's face burned red. "That's not true. He was acting suspicious." "Suspicious how?" The sergeant cut in, his tone turning cold. Before the officer could come up with another excuse, the radio on the younger cop's shoulder crackled to life. "Dispatch to Unit 47. Be advised, FBI has flagged a vehicle matching your traffic stop. Driver is a federal agent. Repeat, a federal agent. Stand down and await further instruction." The younger cop's face drained of color. The officer clenched his jaw. "You've got to be kidding me." Marcus watched the realization sink in. Whatever power they thought they had over him was slipping fast. But just as it seemed like things couldn't get worse for the officer, the sergeant's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting. He looked back up at Marcus, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he turned to the officer and said, "We have a bigger problem." The officer stiffened. "What do you mean, a bigger problem?" His voice was sharp, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes now. The sergeant exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on his phone. "Internal Affairs just sent out a bulletin," he said, his gaze locked on the officer. "You're under investigation." The color drained from the officer's face. That's not possible." Marcus tilted his head, watching him unravel. "Oh, it's very possible." The sergeant continued, his voice steady. "Multiple complaints, excessive force reports, and now this?" He shook his head. "You really thought there wouldn't be consequences?" The officer's breathing quickened. He turned to his partner, but the younger cop took another step back, as if distancing himself even more. He knew this wasn't a fight he wanted to be part of. "This is a setup," the officer snapped. "You can't." The sergeant raised a hand, cutting him off. "Enough." He nodded toward Marcus. "Agent Reed, do you want to press charges?" Marcus studied the officer for a long moment. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, the type that never expected accountability. But now, standing under the weight of everything crushing down, he wasn't so sure anymore. Finally, Marcus let out a slow breath. "I don't need to." The officer's brows furrowed. "What?" Marcus tucked his badge away. "Because by this time tomorrow, you won't just be off the force." He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough. "You'll be answering to the same system you thought you controlled." The officer swallowed hard, his confidence gone. Just then, another squad car pulled up. 2 plainclothes detectives stepped out, their expressions unreadable. One of them nodded to the sergeant. "We'll take it from here." The sergeant didn't argue. He just turned back to the officer. "Hand over your badge and gun." The officer hesitated, his pride warring with reality. But in the end, he had no choice. With shaky hands, he unhooked his badge and placed it in the sergeant's palm. Marcus watched in silence as the officer was led away, his fate no longer in his own hands. As the street fell quiet again, the sergeant let out a tired sigh. "You all right, Agent Reed?" Marcus nodded, glancing at the city around him. "Yeah," he looked back at the sergeant. "But I bet he isn't." And with that, Marcus turned, walking away into the night, knowing justice had finally caught up. The night air felt different as Marcus walked away, calmer somehow. The weight of what had just happened still hung in the air, but there was a sense of finality to it. Justice had played its part. The younger cop stood frozen near the squad car, staring at the ground. Marcus could tell he was shaken. Maybe this was the wake-up call he needed. Maybe next time, he wouldn't just stand by. Or maybe he'd just find a way to justify what happened, like so many others had before. The sergeant called after Marcus. "You sure you don't want to follow up on this?" Marcus turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "I don't need to," he said. "It's already in motion." He had seen cases like this before. The officer wasn't just losing his badge, he was losing the protection he had always taken for granted. As he got into his car, Marcus took a deep breath, gripping the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. It wasn't the first time he had been targeted, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But tonight was different. Tonight, the system had worked. As he pulled away, the city lights blurred in his mirrors, the past fading behind him. He had done what needed to be done, and for now, that was enough.